Hello, and welcome to our Monticello live stream. Today we are talking with Thomas Jefferson as interpreted by Bill Barker. We are talking today about Thomas Jefferson's time as governor of Virginia. Please add your questions in the comments and let us know where you're watching from.
Well, good afternoon, citizens. What a pleasure to invite you here into the salle de manger, our dining room here at Monticello. And, well, you caught me for a moment somewhat reflecting through my spyglass how I was wont to watch for the advance of the British dragoons after I'd been informed of their advance by the gentleman we always refer to as the Paul Revere of Virginia. I'm referring, of course, to young Jack Jewett. He saved my life, perhaps, saved the life of my family, saved the life of many, when he rode all night long to inform us of the advance of the dragoons that had received orders from Lieutenant Colonel Bannister Tarleton to seek my capture, and also to seek the capture of as many of the members of the Virginia House of Delegates that they could discover as we had been on retreat from Richmond to Charlottesville. You know, many ask me of the time that I served as governor of our Commonwealth. Thank heaven I could not succeed myself. You could only be allowed 2 one-year terms. Be elected after 1 year if that was the choice of the Virginia Assembly. They were the only ones who elected our governors at the beginning of our new Commonwealth. Now, I look back on those 2 years not fondly by any means. In fact, those 2 years inflicted a wound upon my spirit, which could only be cured by the all-healing grave. That is so. I had to oversee the conduct of the war as it entered more centrally into Virginia, those years of 1779 to the early part of 1781. So, though this, I am told, will be the subject of our conversation today, please, if you will be kind, to the questions that you might put forth, which will, without a question, spur some ill memories. The floor is yours. I'm happy to hear what you bring on your mind.
Well, Mr. Jefferson, thinking about your governorship and this time in your life that was so dramatic, we know you were elected the second governor of Virginia. Who was the first governor, and were you a candidate in that election for the first governor of Virginia?
Who could ever forget our first governor of the Commonwealth of Virginia, inaugurated, if you prefer to say that, or who took the oath of office as we declared ourselves a new Commonwealth, May 1776. I think you all know who he was. We can never forget Colonel Patrick Henry. Patrick Henry was the first governor of our Commonwealth. I will never forget, he was rather ill at the time. Remember that our capital of the new Commonwealth of Virginia, as it had been the capital of the old colony of Virginia, was still in Williamsburg, Virginia. And the election for the new governor of the Commonwealth took place in the old Capitol building there in Williamsburg. Henry, so very, very ill, actually took his oath of office from the Baid and thereby proceeded as best he could to serve our new Commonwealth. And yes, I'm not going to deny, serve it well. He certainly did achieve. So Patrick Henry, were there others in mind? Well, I'm not going to deny that I was somewhat considered. I will not deny I certainly was not Henry's first choice, that is for sure. And nor was I his first choice to succeed him. But Thomas Nelson was certainly considered. My good friend John Page of Roswell Plantation was certainly considered. But no, Patrick Henry was our first governor. And let us never forget him. I myself have written No one spoke more as the voice of our revolution than Patrick Henry, and I do not know what we would have done without him.
Well, thank you for that answer, Mr. Jefferson. Now, of course, after he was governor, you were the second governor. Where was your inauguration as governor held, and did you have an inaugural ball?
Oh, mercy. You know, earlier I said I hesitate to use the word inauguration. More or less taking the oath of office was all we really achieved. There was no such thing as an inaugural ball, as there might be, of course, many years later when we had established our new nation in Washington City, and even before that in Philadelphia for a good 9 years. There was a ball, I remember, when our capital moved to Washington City, that was held at Gadsby's Tavern. John Gadsby's Tavern there in Alexandria. But consider the war raging about us here in Virginia at the time that I was elected governor, June the 1st, 1779. No, I merely took the oath of office there in the Capitol building, recited the words that were provided me, and that was it. It was then directly to business in conducting as best I could the elements of protecting and defending our new Commonwealth of Virginia.
Oh, thank you, Mr. Jefferson. We have another question. Where exactly did you live as governor of Virginia, and who lived with you?
Well, I cannot help but remember that, where I first took up residence as the second elected governor of the new Commonwealth of Virginia. It was in the old royal governor's palace in Williamsburg. Can you imagine? Though we were now beginning to refer to it simply as the governor's house. I could hardly imagine it. And taking up my accommodations there in the governor's palace, I reflected back to when I first entered that palace as a young, callow youth, having made my way from the wilderness to Williamsburg the winter of 1759 and 1760 to attend the Old Royal College of William and Mary. Within but a few months, I was invited to visit at the governor's palace. Governor Fauquier, Francis Fauquier, of French lineage. He set a mighty elegant table, as you could imagine, with French cuisine also provided there, though we were forbidden to trade with any kingdom of Europe north of the Cape of Finistea in Spain, that Governor Fauquier would provide French wines at his table. So I was invited as a young man, considered by many to be most adept at my studies, to be in his company and the company of my teacher at the Old Royal College of William and Mary, Dr. William Small, and Mr. George Wythe, under whom I later read law. We referred to ourselves as a party quare. Now, can you imagine a number of years later being elected our second governor of the new Commonwealth, that the governor's mansion, the old palace, was still considered to be that seat of the executive. So I moved in to the old royal governor's palace, was there only a few months because we then formally moved our capital of the new Commonwealth of Virginia from Williamsburg, that it might be better defended on the heights of Richmond. You see, Williamsburg, most vulnerable, was on the high ground between the James River to the south and the York River to the north. And we could be susceptible to enemy attack, which is eventually what happened. And so to move to the higher ground of Richmond, you had a much greater advantage to spy the enemy, who could be approaching, sailing northwards a longer distance from Richmond directly down the James River than you would ever have the advantage to see from that high ground at Williamsburg. Now, when we moved our capital to Richmond, I initially took up quarters in a tavern. That's right, Fornicola's Tavern, which was near where our new Virginia House of Delegates were meeting, in a tobacco warehouse. Absolutely right. There was no Capitol building in Richmond at that time, and we're talking about the spring of 1780. So the House of Delegates met in a tobacco barn or tobacco shed, a warehouse, whatever you want to refer to it. It was at Pearl Street down near Cary. I believe they're now referring to Pearl Street as 14th. 14th and Cary Street was where the House of Delegates met. And as governor, I then moved in to a house that belonged to my uncle, Uncle Thomas. Uncle Thomas Turpin is where I went to live. The government rented his house for me to reside there as governor.
Well, thank you, Mr. Jefferson. And speaking of this relocation of the capital from Williamsburg to Richmond, can you talk about some of the challenges of doing so? What was necessary to complete this move? But also, the American Revolution is, of course, going on. Can you talk about some of the wartime frustrations as well?
Well, yes, I can recall that most of the theater of war at that time was not so immediate to Virginia. Most of it was southwards in the Carolinas. It had been somewhat northwards, of course. Now, the natives who had been employed by the British to engage war with us were active out on the western frontier, particularly up along the Ohio. But as far as central Virginia at that time, when we prepared to protect our government moving from Williamsburg to Richmond, there was not such an immediacy to be concerned of war right in the area. It certainly changed within a very short period of time. I remember that most of the concerns that I had as governor were to move, well, what would you call them? The appointments of the office of the executive, let alone much of the furniture of the government that we had in Williamsburg for so many years. That it really truly means the removing of the furniture out of the old Capitol building in Williamsburg, as well as the removing of the furniture, what we could, out of the old governor's palace in Williamsburg. That should not be considered so preoccupying that we would forget the papers of state. And that remained my greatest concern, to protect the archives of the old colony of Virginia. And when you reflect on those archives, we mean not only the good 80 years of archives that we had accumulated with our government being seated in Williamsburg, but before that, the great length of time that the capital of the old colony of Virginia had been seated at Jamestown. I was very interested to do whatever we could to protect and defend those archives. Now, remember, we're talking about the minutes of the first English-speaking representative form of government in the entire New World, English-speaking. The foundation of English common law, that which would evolve and grow to become the democratical Republican system of government and laws and jurisprudence that we appreciate so much as the inherent right of every individual. And that, of course, beginning with that first English-speaking assembly, the Virginia House of Burgesses, Jamestown Island, August 1619, I wanted to make certain, as those archives, those records had been moved to Williamsburg, that they were protected, safe in what was known as the Secretary's Office or the Public Records Office building there in Williamsburg, that we could move them safely, continue to protect them as we would resettle in Richmond. Now, I will tell you this, I was so concerned that the war might follow us to Richmond that I wondered whether they could be well protected there. So I ordered them purposely to be brought the farther west into the wilderness, into the forest primeval. And where do you think that they might be housed? Where all of us thought the enemy would never find them. Charlottesville, Monticello. So that was a great concern that I'm happy I was able to fulfill as we moved our government. Coincidentally, some of you may know, I have even been asked, those who are familiar with our archives, that in that very first English-speaking representative form of government, in that very first House of Burgesses convened in the old church on Jamestown Island, there was a John Jefferson. There was indeed. He had come, sailed from London to step foot on Jamestown Island in about 16 and 15. We know that he invested in one of the upriver plantations, Flowerdew 100 Plantation. And several years later, 4 years later, in 1619, well, he was invited along with another investor at Flowerdew by the name of Edmund Rossingham. So Jefferson and Rossingham invited to represent Flowerdew 100 Plantation in that very first House of Burgesses. And so it was that Mr. Jefferson sailed down the James and was present. Now, there's talk, was he a direct ancestor? And as I have written, I know it is said, and I have seen, that a John Jefferson was in that very first House of Burgesses. And so, therefore, I would reckon, would you not assume, that he could very well have been the progenitor of my direct male line here in Virginia, here in the New World?
Well, Mr. Jefferson, that is absolutely fascinating. Thank you for that. Um, so you've discussed this move to the capital of Richmond. However, can you describe some of the people that were either traveled with you or that you lived with? You've mentioned your uncle, but family members or anyone else?
Well, of course, when you're talking family, we always consider that those of us who have been born and brought up together, and that families that have known one or the other for several generations, are family. And yes, I am referring, of course, to those who may not have a choice to consider themselves as part of the families living at Monticello or living at Tufton Farm or living at Shadwell, where I was born and grew up, or Lego Farm or Pantops. Of course, I'm referring to the enslaved, but they are our families. And yes, as I reflect back to great George, of course, and Jupiter, Jupiter Evans, with whom I grew up, we grew up together. Jupiter, who accompanied me on many of my journeys between Shadwell, where I was born and grew up, to Williamsburg, as I would go there to attend the Old Royal College at William and Mary, both venturing those 5 days in the saddle and returning. Jupiter Evans, of course, accompanied us as our family. And I am referring, of course, now to my own family, Mrs. Jefferson and I, and our daughters, as we left the old governor's palace there that spring of 1780, and then rode eastward to Richmond. Also, if you will, Robert Hemmings accompanied us. Mrs. Jefferson and I, when we married, at the Forest Plantation, that was January 1772, already had known the Hemmings family, Bet Hemmings and her children that were there at the Forest Plantation for some time. So that was when the Hemmings family came to join us, first in Williamsburg, and then later as we moved our government to Richmond town. And of course, the Hemmings, when several other families came to live at Monticello after Mrs. Jefferson and I were married. This is very much the custom of a wife's dowry when she would be co-joined with her husband.
Well, thank you for that, Mr. Jefferson. We have a question from April, who is wondering if your old mentor, Mr. Wythe, had any sort of advising or role while you were governor. Did he advise you at all?
Did Mr. Wythe advise me as governor? He certainly did. He helped to advise me to stay within the law, to help me understand what I could accomplish, impartial as to any political divisiveness that had to be attended to. You're absolutely right, April. Mr. Wythe, oh, I look back on him. He was my friend of all hours. My heavens, we were in company so often, not only discussing law. I read law with him for 3 full years. He only took one student at a time for that length of time. But also, we would spend time in consultation and conversation upon the realms of scientific investigation to discuss the system of things. He very much enlightened me to have a better understanding of the influence of the great architect of our universe, the pursuits of science. And yes, at the time as the war began, Mr. Wythe helped me to understand how I could utilize the law to its best effects while protecting and defending our Commonwealth, not going too far beyond it in presuming what I need to do, in usurping the authority of the chair of chief magistrate of the Commonwealth, the governor of Virginia. That would be illegal. And that is difficult to do, to balance all of that. And I will refer later on to just how difficult that is, considering charges that were brought against me as governor of the Commonwealth of Virginia. Mr. Wythe, as you know, provided the teaching of law to many, many other individuals. Tazewell, of course, was one of them, Littleton Tazewell. He never taught Henry. Henry was self-taught. I should say no more than just that. But Mr. Wythe taught law to my cousin through the Randolph side of our family, John Marshall. That's right. The Chief Justice of our nation read law with Mr. George Wythe as well. Now, the two of us were not reading law at the same time, Mr. Marshall a bit younger. And is it not a rather profound reflection to think that Justice Marshall and I were learning law from the very same law teacher? We were learning the foundation of English common law, particularly how English common law evolves and grows with every successive generation, and the fact that every successive generation then has a right to argue and debate the law. That is an inherent right for every generation. So we were learning this from the very same law teacher. The reason why I reflect upon this so extensively, because what other two individuals in our nation have had more of an argument over the law and how it ought to be interpreted than Justice Marshall, head of our Supreme Court, and myself, a former chief magistrate of our nation. But I will tell you something, April. Mr. Wythe helped us to understand this has always been the argument between an executive and judiciary. It hardly was able to be contested freely under monarchy, as it is now in our nation. But Mr. Wythe certainly helped us to understand that in our new nation, long after Justice Marshall and I are gone, this will still be a great argument and a great debate. That whole idea, perhaps you could say, April, of judicial review.
Well, thank you for that, Mr. Jefferson. We have many people that are aware that later in your term as governor that the British made their way to Monticello. And we have several guests who are asking about what happened, what did the British do, and how did you feel about this? Can you tell us that story?
There's that wound. There's the wound that I referred to but a few moments ago. The wound to my spirit, as I said, I could not possibly have a solution that would be a panacea to cure it until the healing powers of the grave. You are reflecting upon something to which I had felt perhaps I served at a default. That is, in my capacity to protect and defend our Commonwealth. This was the sole purpose that occupied me during those entire 2 years as governor of the Commonwealth of Virginia. And I say this, you might wonder, well, what is the conflict? What was the concern you had? I will tell you why. Our Virginia militia appeared and disappeared with the seasons and the crops. You heard me say earlier that the theater of war was not so immediately centered here in the tidewater of Virginia and farther out west in the Midlands of Virginia. Now, it's not to deny, yes, Norfolk was attacked and burned, and Portsmouth attacked and burned, and the enemy did eventually sail up the James River. That was not until a bit later. So you see, many of those who enlisted in the Virginia militia realized that they were not called upon, as they might have thought they would be, to attend a battle. So what would they do? Quite naturally, they'd simply go back to their farms. They go back to their farms and continue the cultivation of the soil and pursue their occupation as farmers. So this denied the greater protection and defense that we could have had when finally as you know, the enemy sailed up the James River, and never forget who led the enemy into the inner reaches of the tidewater. Benedict Arnold, General Benedict Arnold. Don't get me started on him. So I can tell you, as a consequence, we were all gathered right here in the dining room on Monday morning, June the 4th, 1781, the day that I had been waiting for since I was reelected for a second term. That was the early June of 1780, knowing that a year from now I could not succeed myself. I would be done. I would be finished. We were sitting down at table right here. In the room was the gentleman we knew would be the next governor, the third elected governor of our new Commonwealth. And remember, when I say elected, this was not the freeholders. This was the Virginia Assembly that would be electing the next governor. It was certain it would be General Thomas Nelson, the signer of Virginia, of our Declaration of American Independence. Suddenly, there came a tap on the window pane right yonder there. And remember, too, this was my first mansion house, the first Monticello. This was 1781. I had not yet been to La Belle France. I had not yet gazed upon the construction of the Hôtel de Somme, in which I saw those 3 stories built behind a one-story facade and the capping of a delicate dome. So it was the first Monticello, center section, 2 stories, 2 one-story addendums on each side. But this was still the dining chamber. This is an original room. In fact, probably one of the first rooms to be constructed in that initial mansion house. And by the way, underneath the salle de manger, the wine cellar. Oh yes, the wine cellar, one of the very first rooms below ground to be built here. I remember that we were recalling, this should be in and about the King's birthday. Well, as former Englishmen, we always celebrated the King's birthday. And it was as if a mock toast was to take place when suddenly the tapping on the window panes occurred. We all looked, and here was the bloodied physiognomy of a young man. I seemed to recognize who it was. We invited him in, and yes, here was the son. Jack Jewett, tavern keeper, right here in Charlottesville, the Swan Tavern. And here he was, all blooded. He was panting, and proceeded to inform us that the evening before, he was at his father's other tavern in Cuckoo, Virginia, a distance of about 40 miles northeast from Charlottesville, when he had heard, now I do not want to say collectively British dragoons. And the reason is simply, they were dragoons. They were enlisted in the forces of the enemy, but a number of them were Virginians. A number were Virginian. Well, who knows how? Safe to say this. Who knows better? The handling of their horses. Who knows better? The old native pathways in through the forest and woods and the hinterlands of Virginia than Virginians themselves. Young Jack Jewett had overheard these dragoons, the more they engaged the Jewett hospitality, begin to reveal their orders, coming ultimately from Lieutenant Colonel Bannister Tarp, to be led by Captain McLeod. Captain McLeod was their leader, to venture out westward along the Three Chop Road, mind you, that main artery of commerce, migration east-west from Richmond out west, Charlottesville, and well beyond, that they would be seeking my capture, the capture of Governor Jefferson, let alone as many of the Virginia House of Delegates that they could discover, having retreated to Charlottesville. He jumped on his horse and he rode all night long. All the scratches, all of the blood were coming from the briars and the brambles and everything that he rode through along old native pathways. He knew the back paths to get here more directly. Well, we refreshed him immediately there at the table, and he then took leave and immediately headed to Charlottesville to inform others, as he had informed us. There was another young militiaman. I'm trying to remember his name, and I think it might have been Harvey, that came just a few moments later and informed us of the same. So you might say the word was getting about. So I made certain that I would then ask my family to take leave that they might proceed to their safety, retreat, if you will, from Charlottesville, and venture a good 3-day ride, about 75 miles southwards, to my late wife's inheritance. And of course, as I mentioned, wife's dowry earlier, this then became my inheritance through my late father-in-law, John Wales, and I'm referring to Poplar Forest. The Poplar Forest Farm plantation down in Bedford County, but a short distance from where Mr. Lynch conducts a ferry on the Upper James. So once I saw my wife and our daughters there, all safe in carriage to set out, there seems to be a difference of opinion, but it is said generally that I took my time, that I did not seem to be so bothered, that I was wont to instruct Martin Hemmings and Caesar to gather the family silver, to make certain that it was all put into pillar cases, and then to be, well, placed safely beneath the floorboards of the dining chamber. And I'm not going to deny, what about those records, the archives of the former colony of Virginia? Those first minutes of the first English-speaking representative form of government in the New World, well, they too need to be protected and defended. And so then, recognizing that this was all taken care of, still people saying I took my time, I invited Martin, Caesar to accompany me. They said no, that they were going to remain here. Now, they're varying accounts. I'm just adding another reflection upon this. So I set out alone. I rode to the top of Mount Alto. You can see it right yonder out this dining room window. And as I rode to the top of the mountain, I decided, well, I will dismount, turn about, and see if in the distance to the northeast, the dust was rising from the advancing enemy dragoons. So as I knelt down, my sword got in the way. Now, many people, when I have related this reflection, they say, Mr. Jefferson, why were you wearing a sword? Does the governor of Virginia wear a sword? No, not necessarily. But many people forget I had already been commissioned a colonel of Virginia militia. Yes, I held military rank during our Revolutionary War. My late father, Peter Jefferson, was colonel of Virginia militia. You might say, as his eldest son, that commission devolved upon me. And so this is one of the reasons why I wore a sword, indicating that commission. Coincidentally, I still have the 3 swords that I had worn on various occasions when I was a young man. Not only that very same sword as colonel of Virginia militia, but also the very elegant rapier, the French sword, that I wore in my capacity as minister plenipotentiary of our nation at the court of King Louis, the 16th of France. So my military sword got in the way. I unhooked it, put it on the ground, and I then looked out through my glass to see if I could see the enemy in the distance. I gazed out as far and distant as I could. No. I looked down to the mountain, didn't see anyone around. I thought perhaps there was knowledge by the enemy that they heard Mr. Governor Jefferson had escaped. Maybe he's gone directly to Richmond. Let us gallop more swiftly, if we possibly could, right there, and we can capture him, let alone other members of the House of Delegates. I thought I should warn them. So I quickly jumped upon my steed, rode off several paces, and then, well, I was heading directly to Richmond, Charlottesville. I had left something. That's right. I had left my sword. So I rode back, immediately dismounted, went up to pick my sword. By the way, it was somewhat of a sword cane. It was a very elegant sword that you could wear not only for military rank, but also you might carry it with you for your self-protection during those years of the war as a walking stick. I knelt down, and as I knelt down, I looked over towards Monticello. I thought I saw smoke. Again, I opened up the glass, looked out. The mountaintop was swarming with those greencoats. I reflect greencoats because the British dragoons wore very short green jackets, and now very high bear helmets. Now try to figure that one out in military dress when you're riding swiftly, galloping through the hinterlands of Virginia. But there they were, all of the greencoats swarming all around Monticello. I watched them. I watched them as they burned my barns. I watched them as they devastated my crops. I watched them as they slaughtered my livestock. And I also watched more intently, when are they going to set flames to Monticello? And I watched. There are varying accounts, but it is said, and as I watched, Martin Hemmings came walking out on the west portico. I noticed one of the dragoons ride up to him. I recognized him as Captain McLeod. I'd already known about this officer. He dismounted, went up to Martin, took out his pistol, and placed it at Martin's chest. I saw Martin open his coat. I hardly wanted to look any further through the glass. When I did, Martin was still standing there. The captain put his pistol down, waved for all of the other dragoons to follow him into the mansion house. It was some time later that they then took leave of the mansion house, their arms filled with my wine bottles. I learned many years later, under varying accounts and through various eyewitness stories, that what happened was Captain McLeod was demanding to know where Governor Jefferson was. Now, there are varying accounts to this, but he did not say anything. Who was he protecting? Will be up to the future to decide. And that this is the reason, without any answer, that the dragoons then went in to help themselves. I also discovered they spared the mansion house because, as governor of Virginia, I used the inoculation against smallpox on our Hessian prisoners of war. I ordered that the Hessian prisoners of war, several thousand, barracked in the northwest of Charlottesville, still known as along Barracks Road, inoculated these Hessian prisoners of war against the smallpox. And so it is said that civility in a time of war then helped to spare the mansion house. And think about that. I not only think of the family silver, I think about all of the families accordingly, but it spared the archives of our Commonwealth of Virginia. I think back upon such a unique story, truly unique. You cannot write fiction like that and think that perhaps there was some salvation to come of all of it, despite the great wound to perhaps nothing more than simply my pride, let alone my spirit. It'll be decided in the future how history will look upon it. And one last thing, if I may say so, because I referred to it earlier. Not ever wishing to go beyond the authority of my particular office. Always desirous of maintaining the law as I learned it ought to be maintained by Mr. George Wythe more than any other individual. I was actually accused of cowardice because of this action, as if I fled the office of governor with the advance of the British dragoons. I will not tell you who pressed or insinuated these charges be brought against me. His name has been mentioned. I cannot deny that I have not only inferred it, but written this. But I will say that as these charges were brought against me in the late autumn, in December 1781, I personally appeared before the Virginia House of Delegates, before the Assembly, and I read, if you will, of my concern to attend to protection and safety of our Commonwealth as best as I possibly could, within the law as I possibly could. And thank heaven, I was acquitted. In fact, if you will, recognition of high esteem towards me serving as governor was voted upon and ratified by the Virginia House delegates. So I thank you, citizens. These are long stories about my 2 years, far longer in their storytelling, perhaps, than the 2 years themselves in a period of time. My successor was General Thomas Nelson. And as you know, within a few months after my near capture, October 1781, our war drew to a close with our success at the Battle of Yorktown. I know it would be 2 more years before formally the war came to an end with the negotiations and signing of the Treaty of Paris. But those 2 years, I know, will not be forgotten by many, particularly me.